Evening, morning, and afternoon, everyone, wherever you are. I hope you're having a wonderful week so far. We're here with the latest episode of the Inside Crypto Show, interviews and discussions with regular people just like yourselves. Today, we are joined by Andrew Jacobson, Head of Legal US at 21Co, former enforcement attorney at New York's top financial regulator, the NY Department of Financial Services, and blockchain regulatory attorney at Seward Kissel LLP, where he was advising on key legal issues impacting the cryptocurrency blockchain industry. Andrew, before we dive into today's topic, why don't you tell us about yourself?
Korean, thanks for having me here. Really a pleasure to be here. I started my career in government as an enforcement attorney, New York's top financial regulator, doing banking and other types of enforcement actions. I then spent a number of years in private practice at a law firm where I helped lead and build out their blockchain regulatory group. I joined the company 21Co about 6 months ago, where I oversee legal and compliance. And so really a pleasure to be here, and I'm sure we'll have plenty to talk about.
Nice. Andrew, as someone who studied law, did you study crypto law or was it something you just came upon after you finished your law degree?
It's a really good question. There's no such thing as crypto law. I just want to make that perfectly clear. Anybody who's advising on cryptocurrency or blockchain legal or regulatory issues has some underlying expertise in a particular area of the law. And I'd say that when I was in government about 10 years ago. Our agency, the New York Department of Financial Services, issued what's called the BIT license, which was the first comprehensive prudential regulatory framework for those in the cryptocurrency industry. And so I can't claim to have been interested in the topic 10 years ago, but I'd say about 6.5, 7 years ago, I was much more seriously involved, and over the years have become more involved, and to the point in which it became a very, very big part of my practice. And so I would say, to take a step back, I am a blockchain regulatory lawyer, but that's because I have other expertise, not because I just picked it up out of the blue.
Oh, nice. So, what was that moment? Again, another common question I always ask guests is like, what was that thing that spurred you to say, okay, I've got to start looking into this area more often? Like, what was that memory of yours that said, okay, I'm going to start looking into Bitcoin, blockchain, crypto, that sort of stuff?
When I was in government, I thought it'd be a great area to investigate, quite frankly. The more I dug into it, the more I actually thought it was a great area to put my career in. And so I think what really clicked for me, everybody talks about decentralization, everybody talks about this and that, but really clicked for me was the idea that payments can be processed really without an intermediary. And that to me really changed the game. And you look at some recent conflicts, you look at recent economies where inflation's rampant and the government controls monetary supply, the idea that you can process a payment without government intervention from someone who came from government, came from a regulator, that really what was shocking. And then I think what really transferring money to my own personal hard ledger, it's really amazing that you can have digital money. You can't do that with anything else. I say those concepts really got me interested. But to be honest, quite frankly, I started looking into it because I thought maybe I'd investigate it. And then it flipped me to the other side and said, oh, this is really cool.
Okay. Would you say that's typical for most lawyers who are professing a blockchain expertise? It's incidental that they got involved and learned about crypto and blockchain.
I think really depends. I think I found this area because I wanted to find it. I think there are plenty of people in this industry, meaning the legal industry that advises on blockchain and crypto regulatories. There's plenty of people who come into it because they get assigned to a case, or they get a particular client, or their company's looking into it. And there's nothing wrong with that kind of exposure. But I think the people that are really serious about it, lawyers that are really serious about it, are those that have an underlying interest in the technology and have the ability to apply legal concepts, which are very old, which we will talk about. The US securities laws, the US derivative laws are very old. I think it takes a certain ability to apply those old concepts, really the new facts and new technologies. There are some, I think, that dip their toe in the water, and there are others, such as myself, that have fully been in this industry for a long time.
And we're so glad that we have you. I know listeners and viewers are like, okay, when are you getting to the good stuff? So this podcast, this YouTube show is about FTX and what's happened. And we are on today with the perfect person, of course, to talk about the legalities and everything involved. Before I get started, I want to remind everyone as well that, anything that Andrew and I say here, of course, does not constitute financial or legal advice. Our opinions are our own and not to be connected with 21Co or any of the affiliated organizations. Please, everyone, do your own research. All right, Andrew, some people, they've probably seen the headlines in various media outlets and organizations. Do you want to give us a high-level overview and say what's happened in the last 3 to 4 weeks or so?
Yeah, I think if you're following the news, you've probably seen that there's been a number of events involving a number of companies, some of which may or may not be the subject of criminal or civil investigations. But really, at a high level, FTX, which was one of the largest cryptocurrency exchanges, market makers, banks, not a regulated bank, but essentially operating as one, essentially collapsed over the course of weeks. It's not really entirely clear what caused the collapse, but I think the general view is actually it is clear what caused the collapse, but it's not really clear what events led to the fact that they were completely undercapitalized. That's really uncertain. And in April or May, there had obviously the Luna situation had occurred. FTX had not appeared to be impacted by that, although others in the industry were. Late October of this year, early November, there was some chatter, including some Twitter back and forth between CZ and SBF discussing the validity of the FTT token and other types of issues. And then in mid-November, over the course of a few days, we saw it in public, essentially the collapse of FTX. Some call it a bank run, others call it a Lehman Brothers type moment where they had essentially no capital. And that's really at a high level what happened.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks for explaining that, Andrew. That definitely will help enlighten a lot of people. Now we're getting down to the sort of the nitty-gritty and the legal stuff. So can you tell us what is happening now, and specifically who is investigating FTX or SBF himself?
I think the best indication of who is investigating who, first of all, government investigations are always confidential or mostly confidential, subject to obviously the press getting wind of it or leaks. But I think the best indication of who's investigating FTX comes from the bankruptcy court filing, which, CEO, the newly appointed CEO of FTX, in his filing to the bankruptcy court, said that the SEC in the US, the CFTC, and the Department of Justice are investigating, or they're cooperating, which I read to mean they are investigating FTX, but he's cooperating with those entities. And so the fact that the Department of Justice, the US Department of Justice is involved, that is criminal investigation authority. The fact that the CFTC and the SEC are involved, those are civil enforcement authorities. And so you really have, quite frankly, a very clear and obvious parallel criminal and civil investigation occurring. And that's really a summary, at least what we know right now.
Okay. I took one law class when I was in college in Massachusetts, Andrew, for people who might come from different countries where the legal system is different. Like when it comes to civil and criminal law, what are the penalties or liabilities there? How could this affect SBF himself and FTX?
Really good question. I think that obviously laws differ based on the country you're in, but most countries, most jurisdictions apply the same principles. So what does that mean? In a criminal context, most criminal cases or charges require a degree of knowledge or intent. And you have to prove that somebody knowingly did something that violated the law. And I think that what's the penalty for a criminal case? Obviously jail time, going to prison, some form of incarceration would be a penalty. There could also be a forfeiture action where the defendant is required to forfeit the proceeds of the crime. On the civil side, meaning the civil enforcement side, that is largely a regulatory inquiry, not a criminal inquiry. On the regulatory side, what could the penalties be? There could be a monetary fine. There could be a ban from the industry for a number of years. We've seen that in many cases where individuals defraud investors and they're banned from the securities industry for their lifetime or for the next 20 years. Who knows? And so I think the real clear distinction is, are you going to go to jail or are you not going to go to jail? That's really the distinction between criminal and civil liability.
Okay. I mean, as someone who's been around for a while, I've seen SEC fines. And like most people, I'm wondering, like in cases where the institutions have no money, if the SEC is fining FTX, how does that get paid? Does that bump up to bankruptcy court as being like, this fine is the most important, that gets credited first when they're diluting or selling off assets? How does that work?
Yeah, I think that the focus here will be on a criminal investigation, to be honest. I think there'll be civil charges from the SEC that follow, and there's a number of cases that are pretty good examples for how this would work. But quite frankly, I don't think that an SEC fine or CFTC fine after the fact would really come into play in the bankruptcy proceeding, because that would be a creditor interest that occurred after the bankruptcy was filed. And the SEC actually is a creditor in other bankruptcies, including the BlockFi one, which we saw. And I've actually been trying to figure this out, and I don't know the answer of how a regulator's fine is treated by a bankruptcy court. Are they a secured creditor? Are they not? My sense is that from an optics perspective, it just wouldn't look good that the government got paid before customers. I just think it just wouldn't look good. And if I was in government, and maybe the government would set up a fund instead of just taking the money for their general coffers. But to your point, SBF can't pay a fine now, then he's going to have a judgment against him for the rest of his life. And so any money he makes is going to have to be paid back to satisfy that fine. Yeah, I mean, it's going to be a very complicated situation with really unprecedented facts.
That's very cool. Like, again, one of those, it's so nice to be able to ask these questions because I've always wondered after seeing news items and being around in 2008 as well. Andrew, you mentioned intent to commit like criminal actions. SBF unleashed a whole bunch of tweets as things were going down. And people were always wondering, like, why would you do that? A lot of other crypto personalities undergoing criminal liabilities, they threw AC guys, they're like, okay, they stopped Twitter at all, but he did this. Could these tweets be used as evidence?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Everything that he says publicly or privately that's not to a lawyer, meaning it's not protected by attorney-client privilege, the government is going to get. And I've been doing this work for a long time. And every time I've dealt with a client, do not talk to the press. Be careful what you put in writing. Be careful what you say. Everything SBF has said, either publicly or privately, could be viewed as what's called an admission against interest. And that is admissible in court, at least in the US and likely in other jurisdictions. And his tweets trying to explain the situation, his admissions of failings, his admissions of misconduct, his admissions of everything, prosecutors are going to be salivating over that evidence. And it really provides a very clear roadmap to a potential prosecution, quite frankly. And you mentioned tweets. He also had an interview. We're taping this on Thursday, December 1st. He had an interview last night where he made a number of additional admissions. All that will be played in court. The jury will see it. And I'm sure his lawyers are not pleased with it.
You're talking about his lawyers, and I'm wondering, I saw the news article as well. He said he's down to his last 100K on his credit card. Do you think he's being represented by lawyers? I've always seen this, and again, this might be sensationalist American lawyer TV that I'm used to, but it's like, are people doing this pro bono for him just for being famous and building up your firm's reputation? Or do you think he's actually paying a law firm huge amounts of money to represent him?
That's a good question. The first, law firms need to get paid. The first question often is, how is a defendant going to pay when their money is essentially tied up in regulatory proceedings and court freezes? I don't know how he's paying his legal bills. It's possible that family members are helping pay. It's possible that the law firm representing him agrees to a reduced rate. It's possible they're doing it pro bono because of the publicity. I don't know, but it's a really good question. And at the end of the day, lawyers' fees, the lawyers are going to get paid here no matter what. And still find a way, but my guess is probably either family is paying or helping pay. I'm sure the law firm required what's called the retainer, which is a significant amount of money up front. And then you draw against that as you proceed in the litigation, in the criminal investigations, bankruptcy, you name it. Or quite frankly, the company could be paying his legal fees. I don't know what agreement he has with the company. Sometimes companies will pay employees legal fees. So that depending on their contract, depending on the situation. So it's a really good question. I don't know if we know that yet, but certainly something I'm looking out for.
Nice. We talked about jurisdiction as well. A lot of people have been affected in America. He was on TV in America, and people were really upset about that when we'll get into that a little bit later. And then I saw this earlier this week when the Attorney General of the Bahamas was on TV, and it was like, we're handling this. There's no problem here. Don't worry, we'll get this done. We'll represent everybody's interests. But at the same time, people in America are like, hey, no, this is not representing our interests. It looks like he's walking around. They've been crypto influencers who went to the Bahamas and saw him in sandals and a t-shirt walking around free, and people feel this is really unfair. How does jurisdiction work? Can the US compel the Bahamas to comply?
The Bahamas has what's called an extradition treaty with the United States, meaning the US could apply and request, they can't require, they could request a Bahamian court to approve SBF's extradition to the US. We do that with other countries around the world, and the Bahamas court could reject that. So I think that the key for the US will be, I don't think that he is going to, I don't know what he's going to do, but I think the case in the US is quite clear, actually, from a criminal perspective. And I think from what we know publicly, jurisdiction is actually quite obvious. The US has a number of different statutes that can bring a case under, including what's called wire fraud, which essentially means you'd need to prove that SBF engaged in a scheme to defraud intentionally, and that essentially he used U.S. interstate commerce and U.S. what's called wires, meaning electronic communication networks, the internet, the telephone wires, et cetera, to help further his scheme to defraud. I think that, quite frankly, could be among the most obvious charges. I think also you could look out for securities fraud. He has investors that are in the United States that he theoretically defrauded. Those investors had securities interests in his company. And so I think that's one potential avenue. So I think there will be jurisdiction through the U.S., very likely. The question is, will the U.S. government be able to get their hands on him? Quite frankly, it's not really clear. And if the Bahamas takes their own route here, maybe he's charged there and they don't agree to extradite him. It's a great question. It'll be really an interesting one to follow.
Okay. Speaking of things undergoing investigations and stuff, I know a big sort of social thread on Reddit, on Twitter. It's like, when could we get some of our money? And this is going not just with FTX, with Celsius, with 3AC. And some people are saying, due to the complexity, like 3AC was simpler, Celsius was simpler, but FTX is such a complicated organization with Alameda, and Alameda had all these investments as well into different organizations. Like, people were saying, like, it's 4 to 5 years before regular people can even get some money. And by that time, you might get a few cents on the dollar, if anything at all. What's your take on regular people in the US who've lost thousands of dollars getting some conclusion to everything in the next few years?
It's going to take a long time. I don't know that it'll take 4 or 5 years, but it certainly will take a number of years for this to be all settled. Listen, if you're a customer in FTX, obviously I'm not giving legal financial advice, but it's going to take a long time. The bankruptcy court has to sift through the assets and the liabilities, has to figure out what happened. A lot of the bankruptcy proceedings could be pending a criminal investigation as well, criminal prosecution, both of the company and of certain of its top leadership executives. And in the bankruptcy proceeding, the court's going to focus on legal rights, not going to worry about moral right. As awful as that sounds, courts, particularly in the US, focus on who has a legal right to something, not who should get a right to something. And it stinks. It's the way it is, but that's how I see things playing out.
So in this situation, right, and again, I'm going to say something really stupid because, like most people, I just know lawyer TV. Could this be held up? Let's say the bankruptcy court issues a judgment and SBF and his attorneys appeal, right? Does this go up through the appeal system, and does this drag out longer? Is that a likely situation, or is that just like fake TV stuff that I'm used to?
No, it's pretty unlikely. I think with the bankruptcy situation that it'll proceed pretty efficiently. I don't think there's any opposition from the company. They filed for bankruptcy, so I think it's going to be a pretty smooth process. It's being run now by a new CEO who's done this for other big corporate failures. And so they know the playbook. They know how to get through this. They already have advisors. They've hired blockchain analytic firms. They've hired lawyers. They're looking into this. I don't expect major slowdowns in the bankruptcy. It just takes a long time. Even if it runs smoothly, it just takes a long time. Although when you get to it depends on, if you look at the criminal case, you look at the civil case, that could take a long time as well. And it depends how much SBF decides to fight it. I think it's highly likely that other members of leadership are going to become cooperating witnesses and receive some type of a plea deal. It's very common in these types of situations, particularly where prosecutors need to prove knowledge or intent. Very hard to prove that via just documents. You really oftentimes need witness testimony. And if SBF fights it could take a long time. If he doesn't fight it, maybe it goes quicker. But to your point, I don't expect the bankruptcy proceeding to be overly contentious, but I'm not really sure about the other stuff. It could be. It just depends what approach he takes from a litigation perspective.
Okay. Moving on, Andrew, we talked about this as well, about protections. And in the legal US system for people, are retail customers protected in a bankruptcy setting? Is there something in the US laws that says, hey, we need to protect John Doe and Jane Doe?
It really depends on the laws. It depends on the industry. I think that in this particular situation, it depends on the contractual rights of those retail customers. Did retail customers, were they viewed as what's called secured creditors? What place are they in line as a creditor? I think we've seen in other recent crypto bankruptcies that oftentimes the retail customers are not protected with these big companies, meaning these big exchanges. And unless they had a segregated account, unless they had some type of bankruptcy or insolvency protection, and like I said before, the court's going to focus on legal rights, not really moral rights. And unfortunately, I don't know how great the future is for retail customers of FTX. I think retail customers of maybe other platforms have a better shot, but of FTX, I just don't know the answer. It's really something that has never really been tested in courts, quite frankly. And that's what makes this whole situation so unprecedented, is you have such a big collapse and you have such uncertain legal application. You have such uncertain application of the law to facts. It's never really been done before. And so you look at some of the recent bankruptcies from earlier this summer, Celsius and others, those are still very early stages. They really haven't made any big determinations of how to distribute assets. And so this is something that those in the blockchain space, including myself, have probably been tracing for at least 5 years. We always knew it would come to a head, and it finally is. I'd say it's probably among the more interesting areas that lawyers are following right now.
I mean, speaking of lawyers, and I'm thinking about judges, because I know I've followed a few different tech cases over the years, and I feel like a lot of tech journalists have complained, and maybe even fintech have said, okay, we have lawyers that understand this stuff, but do we have judges? And in the case of the bankruptcy court, do you know, are there judges who at least understand crypto at some level to be able to preside and judge these things?
Yeah, that's a huge challenge. If you're a judge, how could you know crypto really if you've never done a case involving crypto, unless you have a personal interest in it and you took the time to understand the technology? I think that for attorneys in front of that judge, especially the prosecutors and the defense lawyers, it'll be incumbent on them to educate the court about how does this technology work? What is standard industry practice? What is expected? What rights do folks have? It's a huge challenge. And there's been a number of recent cases where courts have issued, securities opinions, meaning, is this particular token of security, is this particular offering violative of the securities laws? And the court just has to, if you've got a good judge who's willing to have an open mind, I think that's great. And judges are careful, though. They want to get it right. They don't want to get overturned on appeal. They don't want to look bad on their public opinion. Court opinions in the US are completely public. Most other countries, they are public as well. And I think the hope is that as more crypto cases go to the courts, will get a better understanding, much like they have for securities cases in traditional finance. And so that's really the hope. The bankruptcies in New York, those are the most sophisticated courts in the world, quite frankly. The prosecution is occurring from New York, most likely. The securities action most likely occurring in New York. And so you're going to have the best judges, you're going to have the best prosecutors, you're going to have the best defense attorneys in the world. And that sets the stage for really a huge battle, quite frankly.
Okay. Andrew, we alluded to this like earlier on in the show with SBF was on the show, the New York Times Dealbook show last night, like early this morning for me here in Taiwan. And lots of people unhappy. People will see the meme on Twitter where people were laughing when he said this statement, and people like shocked, like this guy is on the New York Times. The New York Times has done, what a lot of people have termed softball pieces. And a lot of people are shocked, like, why is this happening? Why is this occurring that this guy's running around after having, and again, just general media's opinion, defrauded a bunch of people, committed criminal actions, and he's on the New York Times to sort of propping him up. I mean, of course, you don't work at the New York Times, but what's your opinion on that?
He's got a right to free speech. He's got a right to say what he wants publicly. That doesn't mean that what he's saying or what he's doing is smart. Doesn't mean it's prudent. Doesn't mean it's going to help him in the long term. And so I watched the interview. I followed everything. It's deeply troubling. I think he's made many admissions that will be played in court. I think that prosecutors are probably, quite frankly, happy to let him speak publicly. Doesn't help his case. I thought initially maybe he would play well in front of a jury. I think now that he's made so many admissions and there's so much evidence proving that this was a crime, I think it's going to be very hard for him to testify in court, because in court in most countries, when a defendant testifies, they're usually not required to testify, and they can't be compelled to testify. But when they do testify, the prosecution can perform what's called a cross-examination, meaning they get time to contradict them, to discredit them, to take statements they've said that are inconsistent and use it against them. And so, prosecutors are going to have a field day using everything he said already publicly, and they're going to use it against him. And going back to your original question, it's deeply troubling. I don't think prosecutors in the US are probably too worried about it. I think they're probably willing to let him say what he wants. I think the key for prosecutors would probably be to ensure that he is not continuing his crime and to ensure that he's not obstructing justice or otherwise destroying evidence. I think that's really the key. But now that he's not involved in leadership, now that he has no control over the company's actions, I think regulators and prosecutors are probably more than happy to let him keep talking.
Interesting. And we're coming towards the end of all these questions, and it's been so informative and very fun. I can't wait to do another episode like this.
Anytime.
I think what a lot of people would like to know is we've had this call for regulation. The crypto industry needs to be regulated. At the same time, there is this sort of cadre of people who are like, this is against crypto, we need to be about decentralization. But at the same time, do you think there will be regulation stateside, maybe even local regulation? Like I remember seeing New York passed no proof of work mining or moratorium on mining for the next 2 years. Are we going to get state regulations, maybe federal regulations? What's the outlook look like for crypto regulation in the US moving into 2023?
Yeah, I can speak to crypto regulation really more globally. I'll talk about the US first. I think there's a big misnomer that there is no regulation. There is. The crypto industry is regulated, and I feel very confident about that. I think the challenge with the way it's regulated is that there really is no unified regulation. And so Europe is coming out with its MiCA framework. That is really the first unified framework. But in Europe, there already exist regulations that cover companies engaged in cryptocurrency activities, and the same with the US. And so you look at the US, how is the US regulating crypto? It's doing so through many different avenues, largely through the states in their money transmitter laws. New York State has the BIT license. Many states let crypto companies become limited purpose trust charters. The federal government has their money services business registration. So crypto is regulated. I think that the challenge here was not regulation. I think the challenge here was leadership, was a culture problem. It was a culture of compliance problem, culture of risk management problem. Would regulation have helped this? Maybe, but FTX was theoretically regulated, the international entity by the Bahamas and the US entity by a number of different state regulators. Where do things go from here? Yeah, absolutely. I think regulators in the US have been chomping at the bit to impose more regulation. I think this gives them a big opening like it gave them after the 2008 financial crisis. I think that there are a number of regulatory gray areas where some companies sit in, where it's not really sure if they should be regulated or whether they need to be. I think those areas are ripe to be plugged like they were during the financial crisis or after the financial crisis. And then I think an interesting dichotomy is the balance between enforcement and what I call prudential regulation. Prudential regulation is a supervisory regulatory regime, meaning one that reviews capital controls, reviews risk programs, one that looks at compliance, looks at other kinds of stuff like that. Enforcement, on the other hand, is more like a hammer. Enforcement comes in, finds a single violation or two, issues a fine, and then leaves. Regulators have focused on enforcement for the past 10 years. I think that there will be a shift to more prudential regulation going forward. And then, Kareem, to your point, will there be new legislation? MiCA is already announced. That was pre-FTX. That's coming out in 2024. The US has had a number of bills that are fairly isolated. I think the US's challenge is that Congress can't agree on anything. So I don't know what's going to happen in the US. You might see something more limited, maybe something focused on stable coins, or maybe a very narrow law. But I can't imagine you're going to see a big, overarching, completely new approach to regulation of the crypto industry in the US. So that's my 2 cents on that issue.
Okay. Another side issue, because I've seen this being argued about on crypto podcasts as well, given what you've talked about today, is like when it comes to laws and regulations and enforcement, right? If a judge makes a judgment, does that supersede SEC and CFTC regulations? And I guess the second part of this question, I've seen crypto people argue about who should regulate crypto, the SEC. Some people argue for the CFTC. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Who should regulate crypto? I think I'll start with that first. I think the entity that there could be a number of entities. The SEC has authority over what are called securities. That's it. The CFTC has authority over what are called commodities. That's it. The CFTC really only has supervisory authority over what are called derivative commodities. They have anti-fraud authority for spot commodities. Where does crypto fit within that? It really depends. Is crypto a commodity? Is it a security? Quite frankly, a token could be a security when it was issued, and then a commodity when it's actually used, or vice versa. So I think that clarity on the status of a particular asset, the courts will determine that ultimately, unless legislation comes out that really binds the courts. But I don't know that I see that happening. Legislation usually will not determine factual issues. It will leave it fairly wide open and leave it to the courts to interpret it. And so back to your point about what governs here. The first thing that governs in the US is what's called the Constitution. That governs. Everything flows from that. Next in the authority chain are what are called statutes. That's legislation. Those are laws. And those are passed by Congress and passed by state legislatures and signed into law by the governors of the states or by the President of the United States. Those laws give various government agencies the authority to issue what are called regulations. Regulations are issued via what's called an administrative rule-making process. That administrative process must comply with various requirements, including giving notice and opportunity to comment, etc. And then where do courts play in? Courts interpret laws. I guess a court could interpret a regulation, but for the most part, these have a lot of discretion to interpret their own regulations, which the SEC has done for a long time. And where do we go from here? Just to wrap this up, I think that there's a lack of clarity on many levels, including statute level. There's a lack of clarity in the courts, which I think will be resolved over the coming years. And then when it comes to regulation, there's a lack of clarity because regulators they need to be doing a better job of issuing guidance, of giving a sense of what is a security, what's not. I hope that answered your question, but I took a roundabout way to get to it.
It totally answered my question. That's fantastic. And I'm just like, oh my God, I wish you were my business law teacher like 20 years ago. Because you just connected everything. I've heard all of these terms over various issues of the last 6 to 8 months. I'm like, oh, now I understand, which is perfect. Andrew, you are a busy person. We don't want to take too much of your time. Final words, final thoughts about SBF, FTX, anything you would like to leave our audience with?
Yeah, I think the final thought I have is that I really believe this was not a problem of technology. This was a problem of human beings, quite frankly. I don't think this is a scar on the industry. I think if anything, it helps sift between the true players and those that are not maybe so true. And so I'm optimistic. I think it's an industry that I've dedicated my career to. It's one I believe in. And I'm excited to move on past this and heal. And that's really my final thought, is that I think the industry has a lot of upside, a lot of progress, and a lot more potential. I'm certainly not giving up just because of this situation.
Me too. I've emphasized that as well. But awesome. Everyone, if you'd like, check down on the podcast notes. If you're listening to this right now, you're like, oh my God, I've got to follow this Andrew guy. His legal opinion's awesome. You can follow him on Twitter. It should be in your podcast player right now. If you're on YouTube, you click the button under the video, show more. You can see Andrew's socials there. You can see the company socials. Please don't forget to follow, share on your social media. I'm sure you found this as fun as I did. Awesome. There are more words, but I can't think of them now. If you'd like to have Andrew on again, if you have any other issues or questions, you can tweet at us, twitter.com/21co_, and then hopefully we'll talk to Andrew pretty soon at some point in the future. Thank you again, Andrew.
It was a pleasure. Thanks for having me.